If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Hello my nightmares, Halloween is just 60 days away. In the spirit of the spooky season, let's share some of the creepiest, most chilling paranormal and Halloween horror stories. I've got one. Halloween night in the early 80s. I was only a baby, but my parents lived next door to a couple and their 2 kids. The kids would often come knocking on the door in the middle of the night when their parents were fighting. My parents would let them spend the night to make them feel safe. Apparently, the man was really cruel and abusive. Well, Halloween night comes around, and the women sent the kids to their grandparents' house for the night. She waits for her husband to fall asleep and proceeds to stab him like 40 times, making sure to kill him. My mother was a witness in court on the woman's behalf, and she did not serve much jail time. Anyway, like 25 years later, I am talking to the people who live in the house now, and they ask if anything weird has ever happened there. I told them about the murder, and they were speechless. They said when they moved in they had to have the place blessed due to strange activity. I can't help but think it was the husband. I can't remember how old I was when this happened, early to mid-teens maybe. I was at a youth group retreat in Oregon, and we were all sitting around the campfire in the dark. I was still cold, so I decided to walk back to my cabin to grab my sweater by myself. I could see plenty without a flashlight, and walking back to the campfire, I was about to pull the hoodie over my head when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw a figure standing about 10 feet tall in a bright as duck white cloak. It was standing looking to what I did not know, and I saw it from its side, no visible face, just pitch black under a stark, bright white cloak standing amongst the trees. It's a forest, basically. I only looked for a few seconds before I noped the duck out of there, running as fast as my short legs could carry me back to the campfire. I did not tell any of the others what I just saw when I got there. I was too scared out of my gourd. To start, I don't have many paranormal experiences in my own house anymore, but I used to have many. Also, just so you know, I know for sure it wasn't a dream. I have a clear memory of it, and I know I didn't fall asleep beforehand. Anyway, here's the story. Back in about May, I'd hear noises at night fairly often, such as creaking steps and floorboards, some louder than others, but here's the one that stood out the most to me. It was when it was around 10 at night and I was just watching videos / scrolling through social media pages, and I started hearing creaking and footsteps starting to happen, but I didn't think much of it. I'm on edge basically 24/7, so I thought my brain could just be making it up. However, the footsteps started to get louder and closer, and I kid you not, I also heard breathing, which had never happened to me in my occurrences. I would guess the breathing seemed a lot softer than a man, so I thought maybe a woman. As it got closer, I was absolutely terrified, shaking and crying, texting my friends what to do because I felt truly helpless. As it was practically outside my door, it just stopped. I was left absolutely shaken, trying to calm myself down. But the scariest part is that around 30 minutes later, I heard my mom come downstairs and turn the lights on. I entered the other room and asked my mom what was happening, confused. She told me that my grandma had died. It was the most unsettling experience I have ever encountered, and I will never forget it. I literally felt chills run down my body at that moment. My first job out of college was in a national forest in Virginia. I lived in an old farmhouse. I rented a room from another FS employee. It was his family's house for generations. My room always felt off to me. We are scientists, so I didn't think much about it. One evening my coworker and I are watching television, and I asked him if anyone had ever died in the room I was staying in. The second I said that, the television turned off, then came back on a different channel. He looked at me and said his aunt, who had a mental illness and had actually chased him once with a knife, died in the bed I was sleeping in. That was wild as hell. For 18 years of my life, I stayed in the same childhood home without moving and slept in the exact same room. Over the years, strange things happened in this room, from your typical items falling off shelves, down to sightings of figures swinging from nooses. The scariest thing to happen to me was when I turned 18. I suffered from clinical depression and insomnia, which left me in a pretty bad shape for years, so perhaps take this story with a pinch of salt, though now that I've left that home, my miraculous recovery from both suggested that my issues stemmed from something outside of my own control. My bed was small and had no underneath, as it was a wardrobe bed combo with the drawers you can pull out. A few days after I turned 18, I had gone to bed at about 3 a.m. early for me. I decided to call my significant other, now fiancé, and sleep on the phone for the night because I had an uneasy feeling. The room was unusually cold and bitter. I had left the window open. I can't sleep when it's too hot. I was just about to fall asleep when something in my head set off. You know that typical something is seriously wrong. Kind or feeling? I heard this loud growl and rustling from the bottom of the bed. However, I didn't have time to react when these hands grabbed my right leg, yanked me out of the bed, and dragged me halfway across the floor. I screamed, freaking out my SO, who started shouting my name down the phone. By the time I could fully comprehend what had happened, whatever pulled me out of my bed had vanished. But what was left behind was a large, deep gash in my stomach. I was rushed to the hospital and admitted to the psych ward for 5 days for self-harm. I'm convinced it wasn't me. That's not even the creepiest part. When I returned to my room, I found several marks around the room. The most notable were scratch marks in the curtains and along the windowsill, leading outside and onto the roof. I'm far away from that place now. It's for the better. But the experience drove me into a career focused on psychology, cultism, and supernatural experiences. This happened over a long period of time, and we ended up naming this thing Jelly. Now Jelly is a shadow person, to put it in plain words, and he likes to stalk people at night. He is huge with impossibly thin legs, a long torso, and 3 arms that end in claws, and his face isn't a face, it's just a shadow. His silhouette outlines a face, nose, lips, and eye sockets, if he turns his face to the side, but otherwise, you cannot see any features at all. He goes everywhere, mainly to nice, quiet neighborhoods, and loves to follow kids. How do I know? Because I've seriously seen him on a few occasions. Jelly is pretty shy, he hides behind bushes and trash cans and vehicles and roofs. He is pretty sinister, following kids between 11 and 16, I'd say. I'm not sure if it is actually Jelly who is everywhere or if there are just many of these things. They range from having 1 to 3 arms, but Jelly has 3. They are also short to tall, depending on how they are hiding. So the first time I saw Jelly, we were walking my friend's Californian neighborhood. There were 5 of us all talking loudly and enjoying ourselves. We were all 14 at the time and decided to do some ding-dong ditching. It was all fun until we came to one house. It was my turn, and as my friends hid, I went up to the house, and when I turned back around to act silly and show that I was about to do it, my face dropped. Behind them was Jelly. He was just hovering over them behind the bush at a crouch as if hiding with them. His faceless face looked up at me, and with one of his 3 arms, he lifted a finger in the SHH position. I screamed and dove to the side of the house, yelling at friends to get out of there. I wasn't there to witness, but the shadow creature cut one of my friend's pants and dug deep into her calf. She was bleeding like crazy, but we hid it well from her parents. They described Jelly in exactly the same way I saw him. He's sinister, likes to play jokes, and really enjoys hurting kids. So watch out on your next walk, one of them may just follow you or a friend. This story takes place when I was about 10 or 11, living in an apartment building in downtown Reno. It was a small apartment with only a living room connected to a small kitchen with a separate bathroom. I've had a few experiences in this building before, and so have my family. But this one kind of stuck with me. I was alone in the house one day because my family went out to dinner. They didn't take me because I was causing trouble earlier that day. I went into the kitchen to get a snack, and I noticed that the bathroom door was open, which was odd because we usually kept it closed because of the smell, and I went to investigate. After a minute or so, I determined that one of my siblings must have left it open before they left, and I went back to my business. About 15 minutes later, I had to use the restroom. I've had bladder issues my whole life, and I went through the kitchen to get there. I looked in the kitchen mirror and sort of nodded at myself. Back then, I was very obsessed with my appearance, and I thought I was hot stuff. Anyway, after I finished up in the bathroom, I went to do the same thing in the bathroom mirror, and I was shocked to see that my reflection was different. And I don't mean making a different face, I mean acting completely different. Didn't move like me, smile like me, or anything. I was honestly terrified. When I decided to just leave the bathroom, I saw that my reflection had finally smiled. However, it wasn't my smile. It was evil, inhuman. If you can imagine Joker from DC combined with Huggy Wuggy, that's kind of what it looked like. Judge me all you want, but I never looked in that mirror again. A few months later, the mirror broke of its own accord and had to be removed. Nothing like that has ever happened again. This was after the Christmas Eve party, and when everyone went home, I decided to stay because my cousin and I were watching a movie. My uncle, who used to walk his dogs into the woods next to a park, went off to take them out. Before this, my aunt told him to don't do that because it was too dark out there. It was around 4 o'clock or 5 a.m. He didn't care much, and he went off anyway. My aunt was still worried, so I went along with him. Once there, anything wrong seemed to happen. Everything was quiet. My uncle and his dogs were having a relaxing walk, as usual, and I wasn't really paying attention to the surroundings when suddenly, the dogs went still. This wasn't that strange, they always stopped their way to stare and bark at other animals they noticed, like rats, birds, insects, or other dogs. However, this time was different. When the dogs got still, my uncle and I noticed something was wrong. The dogs weren't angry or curious, they were kind of nervous, anxious, and afraid. One of the dogs, the largest one, was growling and shaking. As my uncle started to get worried about that situation, we heard it. People in the woods, we didn't see how many, because of darkness, they were saying something. We all gather here, by the blood of, incomprehensible, we, incomprehensible, thee and thy, incomprehensible. As my uncle and I heard that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him out of the woods. As we all left, he turned his head back, and he only saw a slight movement of branches and shrubs, perhaps because these people were trying to hide. After all that happened, he hasn't walked his dogs near those woods, nor when it gets dark. Once we and my mates, about 6 of us including me, were taking a shortcut through a graveyard park at night. It was basically a cut through 2 separate main roads with the park going through a fairly large block in between, but the cut going from one end to the other should have taken like 3 to 4 minutes max. Anyway, as we're walking, we get to the part of the park that's right at the thickest concentration of graves in the vicinity of the really old church. The first one to see something was a different friend of mine who usually gets a bit nervous in these situations. He said he saw a pair of weird, shining eyes staring at him from a silhouette. One of our friends points their phone torch at the place he was pointing at, and we see it's actually just a mildly scary statue of a stone angel above a grave. We dismiss it. But as we keep walking along, more of us seem to see it. I'm the third person to notice it. Out of the corner of my eye, I notice it, this weird featureless blank face and this entirely gray shifting human silhouette, with the only thing setting it apart were those burning bright white eyes. I nearly screamed right in that spot. Each time we checked it, it was still only a statue or some other sort of graveyard ornament, but after that, it seemed we'd been walking through the area far longer than it should have taken, and by the time our fourth friend notices the strange thing, we break into a run. 6 grown guys just full on sprinting through the path of the graveyard at night like scared little kids. We all kept running without looking back, but the longer we ran, the more it felt like something was reaching out to us from behind. Even though we should have been near the end, it seems to take a few minutes of running before we even start to see the light of the street on the other side of the gate coming into view. We double down on our run, and my first athletic friend literally jumps over the gate. A second before I reach it as well, I turn my head back slightly, and I swear some way in my mind or other, whether it was a delusion or a part of the hallucination, I see the full form of this grotesque expressionless figure barely 50 meters behind us. I say this because within the next second I and the rest of our friends had jumped over the gate into the lighted street, but when I turned back to look at the last spot I'd seen, there was nothing there, no graves, no statues, not even a tree that I could have mistaken. It was just an empty, open spot on the grass. This happened a few years ago with my friend June, when we were probably 17 or 18. I'm 23 now. We were out driving around late at night on country roads. We were teenagers growing up in a rural area, so going for a drive was one of the main ways we passed the time. We were both into goth stuff and witchcraft at the time, so we pulled off the side of the road to walk around a small graveyard in the woods. It was impossible to see at night, but we'd gone there a few times in the day before, just to hang out. The whole area is heavily forested, but the path to the graveyard is short, it's right next to the road, just barely hidden in the woods. Anyway, we started slowly on the small loop that takes you around all the gravestones, using our flashlights to read the names and look at the carvings of the stones. I was very comforted by graveyards and the night at the time, so I was honestly very relaxed, and we mused about ghosts and death and whatnot, as goth teenagers do. About halfway around the loop, at the furthest point from the car, June got my attention as she'd noticed a light in the woods. It looked far away, like it could have been a car on the road, so we turned away and kept walking. However, about 30 seconds later she got my attention again, and the light was much closer and obviously quickly moving toward us, and then I heard the sound of someone crashing through the woods. It was obviously someone with a flashlight making a beeline toward us, and we backtracked and ran to the car. I unlocked it and climbed into the driver's seat, turning the car on as fast as I could, and right before the lights came on, this huge, grisly-looking man dressed head to toe in camouflage, carrying a huge crossbow, and wearing a headlamp busted out of the foliage and was coming right for the car. He has this manic look in his eyes that just made me want to escape even more, so I reversed as quickly as I could and peeled out of there. We didn't stop driving for a while. Even though we never saw him following us after we drove off, We both couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Finally, I think we both got too tired to stay out any longer, and we went back to our houses, but I still constantly believe about how quickly he got to us. If we hadn't sprinted right when we did, he would have caught us as we were getting into the car. I literally slammed my door about a second before he came barreling out of the woods toward us. Plus the fact that there are no houses nearby. This person was waiting in the woods in full hunting gear with a weapon, and we clearly weren't animals, as we had a flashlight, and there isn't a no trespassing sign in sight. The whole area around this graveyard is state park. I go out into the woods and into weird places in the night a lot, and I've seen some stuff I would consider supernatural that really scared me, but none of those things ever truly made me afraid to go into the woods like he did. I still go out on my own, but I really never let my guard down like I used to. About 10 years ago now, I was in my senior year of high school. During mid-October, me and a friend decided to stay over at her house. It was on the edge of our small town, where a few farms and a ranch are. Like usual, we went into the fields in the evening and played Ghost in the Dark with some other friends that lived near the area. The basic rules of the game are that one person is in the ghost and hides while the others try to find them. When the ghost is found, the person who finds them is the next player to be it and calls out Ghost in the Dark, then everyone tries to run to a designated home base without being tagged by the ghost. We played a few rounds and then noticed that two children, one slightly taller girl and a shorter boy, we had never seen before were watching us. They were both around 10 years old or younger. We asked them if they would like to join us, and they just shook their heads and said no while still standing at the edge of the field. It was odd because it was pretty late at night for younger kids to be out. After another round or two, we decided to part ways with the others and go back to her house. We didn't see the kids when we left and assumed they had gone home. Now her dad was paranoid, living on the edge of town, and had security cameras set up facing the front door, garage, and backyard. It also kept us from sneaking out at night, knowing he could just check if we had left. We went upstairs and started to play some video games until about 1 a.m., when she peeked out the window and said someone was on the driveway. I looked and saw one of the kids from earlier. She was the taller girl. I asked my friend if she lived near there, and she said she didn't know. I opened the window and called out to her, asking if she was lost or needed someone to walk her home. She just kept staring at the house. We then decided to go downstairs because she was at the end of the driveway and possibly couldn't hear us. My friend's dad was still up working on something in his office, and we told him about the little girl. He got up with us and went to go look out the front window, and no one was out there. He asked us if we were trying to scare him because Halloween was near, and he went back to his office. We shrugged it off, thinking she had gone home. A while later, her dad went to bed, and we were making some snacks to watch a movie downstairs. We heard a very quiet knock on the door. I almost didn't hear it at first until my friend asked about it. We tried to ignore it and watch our movie, but we heard it again, this time a bit louder. I started to get nervous because it was the middle of the night, so we woke up her dad and told him. He thought we were trying to play a prank again, but to make us feel better, he showed us the security camera footage, and we saw the little girl standing on the driveway again. This time he really believed us and called the police, saying there was a child out at night wandering the street. She was just standing in the same place, and it really freaked me out, and at that point I wanted to go home. We waited about an hour for the cops to show up, and when they did, there was no sign of the little girl. They told us they hadn't had any reports of a lost child or anything, and they would drive around and look for her. I wanted to go home, but I was too scared to leave by myself because it was the middle of the night. In the morning her dad was looking at the security footage of the previous night so he could take a screenshot of the girl to take to the police station, and we saw her walk up by herself and just stand at the edge of the driveway for 20 minutes at a time, then leave for a while and come back for about 2 or 3 hours. She was probably just a lost little kid, but we didn't see her or the boy again, and we still can't explain the knocking on the front door. It could have been the wind or maybe the little boy out of view of the cameras. Her dad never told me if the police said anything about it. But that was the last time I stayed at her house. I currently live alone at my great-grandparents' house, which was my grandpa's childhood home. It's been in the family basically since it was built. My great-grandpa didn't die in the house, but he was rushed to the hospital from the house and eventually died. It's important to note that a lot of the original furniture is still here. So my great-grandpa was a stern but affectionate guy. He was that trope where the big tough scary dude is secretly soft for kids and animals. Above all, he was a known lover of cats. He always had at least one cat. He rescued kittens constantly. My cats always seemed to congregate where he used to spend his time. Where his chair used to be, in his old bed, at his seat at the dining room table. I've always sort of felt his presence in the house. I wasn't especially close to him because, like I said, he was a super intimidating type of dude, lol, but he was kind to me and my sisters and cousins. During Hurricane Sally, we lost power in my city for about a week, and on the first night, when I was trying to wait the storm out alone, super nervous, his old alarm radio came on. It was static, but it sort of sounded like a man was speaking, maybe on a talk show or something. I'm sure there's a logical explanation. I'm not tech savvy, but this radio has no battery power feature, like it has to be plugged into work, and no matter what I did to it, it wouldn't go off or turn down, even when I fucked with the volume. I started living here with my dad shortly after his death when I was about 15, and now I live here alone as an adult. I don't know if it's the memories or what, but I've never felt alone in the house, even when I was sure I was. It was about 15 years ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. My brothers and I had just come home from trick or treating with my mom. My dad wasn't there because he was at work, and we stayed on the third floor of these apartments. Well, it was bedtime, so my brothers were getting out of the shower, and I was already getting ready for bed. I did what I do every night, pray. So as I was finishing up my prayers, something told me to look out the window. Now mind you, it's well after 9 or almost 10 at night, and the streetlights were on. When I looked outside, it didn't click immediately, but it slowly dawned on me that there was something out there in the street under the lights. Me thinking because it was Halloween, it was just someone in a costume, so I continued looking at it, but the more I looked, the more I noticed how wrong it looked. It was missing eyes, its clothes were transparent, and the wind was blowing a little, so the little bit of clothes it did have on flowed with the wind. It had no arms or legs but was standing up on a wooden stick. It basically looked like a scarecrow. 30 more seconds of looking at it, and no one was around, no one walked to it, no one was holding it, and it stood completely still, and I was getting terrified. I hopped up and ran to tell my mom, but by the time she came, it vanished. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and I was scared to walk to my bus stop the next morning because I had to walk past the spot where the scarecrow was standing. By the end of the day, I forgot about it and eventually pushed it to the back of my mind. Eventually we moved into a house, and all was well until the next year. On Halloween, I saw that same scarecrow again. I was terrified, and this time everyone was home, and yet again, when I called my parents to come see it, it vanished like it was never there. But the weird thing is when I left the house the next day where that thing was standing the night before, instead of it being a wooden stick print in the dirt, it was footprints, but they didn't belong to anyone inside the house, and they started from that spot and led all the way to the foot of the woods, and then they just stopped. My dad and I went hiking a few days ago. My dad is a waterfall fanatic, and he wants to see as many as possible. So, he and I are hiking along a very pretty trail. We're hiking along a river, it's flowing nicely, there's mountains all around us, the trail is weaving around big, beautiful boulders. I'm hiking at most 30 feet ahead of him looking for a spot to stop and have a sit-down picnic lunch, and as I rounded a blind curve in the trail, I just frozen. Sitting on a stump maybe 10 feet off the right side of the trail is a guy. He is wearing one of those colorful Baja hoodies with the hood pulled up and a half mask with rabbit ears. He sees me and stands up, right as my dad rounds the corner. We are all three setting each other up in silence, and my dad addresses him. "What's up, buddy?" The masked man tips his head as if he were deciding what to do with us and then says back, "Not much. You aren't the guys I'm waiting for. Have a good day." Then he turns and jogs off quickly into the woods. Strapped on his lower back was a large hunting knife, and he had a pistol on his hip. We lost sight of him pretty quickly. We hadn't seen a soul on the trail all day, and we had been hiking for almost 3 hours. Needless to say, we left the waterfall for another day and quickly turned around. Once we were off the trail, we reported it to the local Forest Service and the police, but they said they couldn't do much aside from keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. The masked guy didn't have a backpack, or water, or anything, which makes me think he had either stashed it somewhere or was maybe camping and waiting nearby. I hate to admit it, but I desperately wanted to go after the guy and ask who he was waiting for and why. My partner and I were driving down a steep hill in my city, with me in the passenger seat. Traffic was fairly busy as usual, as it was only about 8 p.m., and the road is one of the main routes for commuting out of the city. I'm just kind of enjoying the journey, as the car was comfortable and warm, and I was looking forward to dinner when I got home. I noticed out of the front window and to the right that somebody was about to walk in front of oncoming traffic. I panicked and shouted out loud to my partner that someone was about to get hit and potentially thrown into our path. But at the moment they were about to be hit by a small white van, their top half disappeared, but their legs were still walking into the road. It is the most bizarre thing I've ever seen in my 32 years alive. The legs took a few steps forward, they weren't solid, as I could see the vehicle's headlights through them, yet they weren't completely transparent. So strange. I had consumed no alcohol, no drugs, not even a paracetamol, and I wasn't tired or stressed either. Still to this day, I won't go on that stretch of road. I'm from Ireland. I can tell you people here are quite superstitious, even paranormally inclined, and I am no exception. So this happened about 6 years ago. I was about 13 at the time and was living in a small village up on the inclined region of County Wicklow, basically up in the hills sitting next to a basin man-made lake. I had coerced my friends to go up to the lake, as at the time we were feeling adventurous. It was autumn, and the smell of oak wood burning was wafting through the air. The trees were shaking in the wind, typical Irish Halloween season spooky stuff. The village has had a rich history. The village as it is now was built around the lake, i.e., Lake Incuda, mainly because it wasn't always a lake. The village used to sit in a valley with the old church up on the edge. So in the summer months, when the lake water levels dip down, you can see the tops of some buildings sticking out. Below is a quote from some guy off of an Irish forum. Blessington Lake is extremely dangerous. It was created in 1942 with the flooding of the townland of Ballinahown. There are large holes in it and a strong current, and each summer you see lots of young Dublin lads jumping off the bridge anytime there is any hot weather. If they could see underneath the water, they might think twice. Several people have drowned there, and there have been several suicides in it too. So to continue, the part of the village I still live in still has its old roads. The walkway to the lake is connected down by a local cemetery. For being a small village, it has seen a fair amount of out-of-the-ordinary deaths. There have been about 4 accidental deaths and about 8 suicides within the space of 20 to 30 years that I know of, but this is Ireland, not that densely populated region, may I add? So me and about 2 other friends are walking down the pathway towards the lake, which by the way has no street lights, being that this is rural Ireland and street lights are kept only on main roads, etc. As we walk, I start to get a sense that something is watching me. In the darkness, I'm seeing quick moving shadows flickering about in my vision. We could all see only about 2 feet ahead, and we tried not to bump into each other. It was until we got to the gate that stops cars from driving onto the beaten path that things got extremely uncomfortable. There was a sudden shift in temperature, and I could tell my friends were uneasy, even more so than me. As I jumped the fence, I froze for what seemed like an eternity. My eyes couldn't believe what was in front of them down the trail. All crouched down in the middle of the path was a shadow, but this was night. It moved swiftly across and darted into the long grass. All of this happened so quickly that I dismissed it as my eyes were playing tricks. Despite this, we continued down the path. As we cleared the path and began to see the lakeshore and old church ruins, my perceptions became more real. In the distance, the black mass had returned. This time, it was more defined, and as we inched closer, it only became clearer and clearer. By the time we were about 3 long jumps away, we realized what it was, a priest in clerical robes. My friends and I were silent the whole time until one of them piped up to say hello. He didn't seem to notice. It was like a projection, a hologram. We continued to walk forward, and so did he. Every step I could feel my heart thump, and every step we could hear the silty sand crunching under his feet, and then, as if a mist of time shrouded our vision, it was as if time froze. He had begun to descend into the lake and simply dissipated into it, then it got cold like a winter breeze brushed our necks and our souls, and that's when we ran. We ran for what seemed like ages. The path seemed to stretch and stretch, distorting like an endless hall, but we finally reached the gate. We hightailed it over, and I fell, but my 2 friends continued running. In a haze, I looked behind me and saw nothing but silence, pure and utter silence, just the trees and me in the dark. It's one of the few instances from my early teens I vividly remember, and to this day I won't go back alone, only with a friend or friends. It was only recently that I heard the local minister from the church had found a Bible in the ruins of the church, which was a bit interesting, but I don't know. I just hope I never run into that thing again, as I haven't yet. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington, near Mount Rainier. Not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something, open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude just sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence and a guy that was probably high or something and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness, someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and, kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance but slowly decided sounded more like a human making animal calls, but could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to the car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. This happened when I was 15. I'm 55 now. I was entirely alone in my house. Mom and my brothers were out of the house for the day. I think I must have been cleaning my room. And coming up out of the heating vent from the basement below was a grating, grinding growl of a laugh. The laugh was not humorous, but rather cunning and menacing. It had me, and it knew I was alone and helpless. I froze where I stood in terror. I had 1,000,000 thoughts. There was a demon in the basement. I stood there unmoving, because to move would be to acknowledge I had heard it. Listen, damn it, I was 15. Not the most rational of creatures. I tried to rationalize away what I had heard. Maybe it was my older brother playing a joke on me. Of course, it wasn't. That voice had been deep and guttural. Not even a grown man could have hit those low notes. I stayed frozen until Mom came home. I couldn't tell her or anyone what happened. To admit that it had happened would be to let the entity know I was aware of it. Then I'd be in even greater danger. I tried to never be alone in the house for a long time after that. But something began to happen inside me. I had always been a very scared sort of kid. I would sing any time I had to enter the basement because, of course, they can't hurt you when you sing. This was even before the laugh. Lol. But as time passed, I began to get braver about it. I still wouldn't talk about it, but as I got older, I began to get angry at the voice. It had scared me, but nothing had happened to me. It didn't come after me or try to get me, whatever the thing was. The only power it had was to make me feel fear. And so, my fear of the basement began to lose its power over me. So much so that one of my brothers and I were in a bad fight one time. I hid tightly behind the furnace in the dark basement, so he couldn't find me. He was more afraid of it than I was. So what is the point of all this? I still believe in the existence of evil. And then it can mess with us. But I also think there's a lot of hope. Okay, so this happened to me earlier, and I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. I'm currently staying in a remote part of the United Kingdom and having a break from working, which means more time to pursue my hobbies, one being photography. I had scoped out a creepy-looking tree formation in a nearby forest and set my camera and tripod up as the sun was coming down, for that extra creepy vibe. As I'm happily taking photos, I see a woman pass the entrance to the arched trees. This woman had parked her car next to mine when I arrived. She went past a couple of times, looking at me for prolonged periods with each time she passed. I assume she wants to come up this path but sees that I'm taking photos, so decides to walk elsewhere. Approximately 5 minutes go by, and she appears again, this time walking towards me, dragging her left side slightly with this strange limp. She stops once and stares at me for a few seconds, then starts walking towards me again. I ask her if she's okay, I'm starting to put my camera away at this point and prepare my tripod to use for self-defense if necessary because the vibe I'm getting is way off, and she starts grunting at me, then stops and stares again. It's at this point that this woman is close enough for me to realize that she's actually a man in a woman's clothing, with a wig. An uncomfortable moment passes, and she starts grunting again, walks towards the edge of the path, grabs a pile of leaves and starts throwing them around, grunts some more, and then walks off aimlessly into the forest. I call my friend to tell her what's happened and ask that she stay on the phone in case this person comes back. I'll just take a couple more photos, and then I'm out. For a good 10 minutes, I hear the crunching of leaves circling me in the forest, and I just convince myself that it's wildlife. Then, silence. I take the photos, and I haven't seen/heard the person for around 15 minutes now, so I assume I'm safe. I step off the path and notice that the car has disappeared. Thank you. Duck. However, I very quickly notice that there is a man walking towards me from the entrance. It's the same ducking guy. He has changed into men's attire, and as he walks past me, he shoots me a grin that sends shivers down my spine. I don't scare easily, but this guy just gave off all of the wrong signals, causing this overwhelming feeling of dread to wash over me. I'm still on the phone at this point and holding my tripod over my shoulder, just in case. I quickened my pace and got back into my car. As I did so, I saw him come out of the lane I had been down, stop and look around, then start walking towards my car with intent. I video for a while and then haul the duck out of there, driving past his car that he had moved down the road and thinking, what in the gray beard duck just happened? I travel a lot for work, or used to anyway. In my travels, I have met numerous people who have needed aid of some kind. I have driven people to the airport, changed tires, etc. At some point, I will end up in a ditch in my own blood, but so be it. I forget which town/state I was in at the time, but in driving from the airport to the town I was to work, I had to take this long local road. There were only a handful of houses along the entire thing, and it took about 45 minutes to drive there. About a third of the way down, I pass a man in a flannel shirt and jeans walking along the side of the road. I typically don't just pick up people, and I myself like to walk, so I just kept on driving. After a couple of minutes, I am noticing that there is nothing around. No houses, streets, or anything. So this dude is going to be walking for a while. So I decide to turn around and drive back to ask him if he needs a ride. As I'm going back, I do not see him at all. It's getting to dusk, but it's not dark yet, still plenty of light. Along the road are just fields, so it's not like he went into the woods or anything. And finally, I get to a point, which I knew was way before the point I had passed him, so I turn around and go back. I eventually get to where I am going. I pull into a gas station to fill up, and as I am waiting, I look to see the same guy walking up the road. Now, I never saw his face. But same stride, same flannel shirt, and jeans. It could very well have been someone else. I told myself this. But the coincidence is ridiculous. But the time it would have taken for him to make that trip is simply impossible. We would have had to cover over 20 miles in half an hour. In the 1980s, I had relatives in Island Pond that we would visit frequently. We would often walk from one house to a few apartments on Hillside Terrace to visit our cousins. It was not the shortest walk, but it was pleasant enough walking past the old homes amongst the trees, with one exception. On the corner of Mountain Street and Curran Avenue, there was a derelict house, no longer there, that we jokingly called the haunted house. It was an old home with a decent-sized porch and overgrown front lawn and was boarded up. One of the large boards covering a window to the right of the front door had two knotholes that looked just like eye holes. We would dare each other to knock on the front door. Only one of us managed to enter the tall grass and, no more than 2 steps in, found a dead cat and booked it out of there. The front of the house faced Mountain Street, and the side faced Curran Avenue, and at the time, there were no houses across the street on either side. So, we would give the house a wide berth and walk on the other side of the street. As spooky and off-putting the front was, it got worse as you walked down Curran and could see behind the house. It looked as though all of the previous occupants' possessions had been tossed out the back. There were old bed frames, dressers, clothes, and chairs. There were also decrepit deer heads, a moose head, and several nude life-size dolls, the kind with the eyes that would close when you would lay them down. Reclining there, partially covered in moss, some looked as though they were winking at you. One evening, my brother and I were walking with our mom to visit my cousins, and we had just started walking down Curran along the side of the house when my mother just stopped. I looked up at her and could see a puzzled look on her face. She was not looking at me, though. Her eyes were fixed on the house across the street. I looked too, and there in an upstairs window, there was a light that clearly showed the silhouette of a woman. Based on the height, it looked like she was seated and was doing her hair. All three of us were frozen for a moment, and then it was like our brains suddenly made the connection that this made no sense, and we broke into a run and did not stop until we hit the road by the apartments. We told my aunt, and that evening she drove us the back way home, avoiding the house. We talked about what we had seen the next morning at breakfast and convinced ourselves that there had to be a logical explanation. So in the bright light of day, we started walking back to the house. We knew it couldn't have been a projected shadow from a nearby home, as there were none, especially on that side. We thought maybe someone had moved in, or perhaps even a squatter. Along the front of the house, nothing looked out of the ordinary. Scary? Yes, but not a board out of place, and not a blade of grass tramped down. So we turned down current to look at the window, and the blood turned to ice in my veins. There, on the second floor, was the window where we had seen the lady in the light. It was completely boarded up. We fled back the way we had come. 30 plus years later, it still chills me. When I was 18, a friend and I heard this story of when Charles Manson was released from prison and he wanted to go to the Devil's Staircase in a town 3 hours away that was also a ghost town. The story is this is a staircase to hell hidden somewhere nearby. It was also mentioned a man was watching the area on his behalf. Of course, being 18 and stupid, we decided to meet my friend in the bigger town outside of it and head out. We pulled in to see a tiny town with a row of boarded up homes and maybe a store, but from decades ago. We parked on the side of the road just to take a peek around. Looking back, I'm so glad this was during the day. We walked about 10 steps, and we saw a man riding barebacked on a horse towards us. He looked dirty and had a face that was worn. Only had a few teeth and asked us what we were doing there. He first asked, "Are you the kids that came here that burned down the old church a few months ago? They had a car that looks just like yours." We answered that we were on our way to a town a couple hours west and noticed signs leading here. He knew of this town and said that he's not a fan of anyone there. He asked if we were from there, and we told him no. He then proceeded to say, "It's a good thing you aren't from there, or I'd have to shoot you. Got the plots dug up already." Of course we are shitting ourselves, apologizing for even stopping, and he goes, "Tell everyone is Williston, I'm coming with a gun," then rode off. We ran to our car and got the duck out of there. A few years later, I was telling the story to a new friend from the larger town nearby I mentioned earlier. She said that she and her friends went out there to drink since it's buried in old coal mines because they were underage. They got out there to find about 20 expensive cars that were immaculately parked all over the land. They saw a huge fire in the distance but got freaked out and got out of there. She believes there may have been a satanic ritual occurring because she knew of the Devil's Staircase story. One thing that stuck with me is what the man on the horse said as he rode off, "Tell your friends to stay the duck out of Tagus," and we absolutely did. I rented a house with 3 other roommates. After moving in, everything was fine for a while until 2 of them went out of town. My one roommate and I were in the basement watching movies and decided to sleep on the couches since it was the first night everyone wasn't in the house. From right above us, in the upstairs living room, we heard an incredibly loud dragging sound as if someone dragged our kitchen table across the floor, and so we were convinced someone was upstairs. We thought maybe one of our roommates came back. We decided to go up and check it out, and nothing. Doors locked, no roommates there. This continued for the next couple of days, getting worse and worse, and only occurred at night. We also heard sounds like someone was running up and down the stairs. One night we went and checked out all the rooms to make sure. After turning off all the lights and closing the doors, we checked underneath to make sure all the lights were off. We heard the sounds again, and when we went back upstairs, the spare room light was on. We tried to tell ourselves it's just the only house making noises, but once our roommates got back, it never happened again, but things got worse. One night I woke up to someone banging on my room door. I opened it, and no one was there. I talked to my roommates the next day, and they were all sleeping. We've also all had friends over who heard the sounds of someone running up and down the stairs too. All my roommates also experienced waking up in the middle of the night sensing someone watching us. It was creepy, to say the least. The scariest thing I experienced though was one night I got up to use the washroom, and when I went to open the door, I had a very intrusive thought that said, "If you open this door, you will die, just wait." I had an overwhelming feeling of dread, then it passed like nothing happened, as if the entity was gone. I've never had an intrusive thought like that before. The weirdest part was that after most of my roommates moved out and others replaced them, one of them told me they experienced the same thing. I never told the new roommates about any details of the strange things that happened, just that weird things do happen because I didn't want to scare them but thought they should know. Sometimes the presence would feel very threatening, other times it was very chill. Does anyone have some sort of explanation? Or have had a similar experience? Since I've moved out, I haven't had anything strange happen but have at places I've lived prior to. This is my mom's story from the late 1970s and early 1980s, when she was a little girl. Mom, my aunt, and my grandma and granddad were on a trip in Scotland near the Isle of Skye. They were driving on a main road and came to a little town. I can't remember what it was called, but all the houses there were small, one-story white houses with straw roofs like something from the 1700s. There were no cars, and everyone looked dirty and was wearing dirty old clothes that were like what peasants from the 1700s would wear. As they drove into the village, the road turned from tarmac to a dirt and pebbly track. All the people in the village gathered around the car as Granddad drove slowly through, and individuals began to gather around the car as it drove carefully, all holding pitchforks, iron rods, and other objects, and began bowing to the car and shouting things that sounded like prayers as it drove through. People who weren't gathering around were staring and screaming and shouting as they drove through. My mom remembers that she and her sister pulled faces and stuck out their tongues, and they drove through. They assumed there was some ceremony going on and thought nothing of it, except that it was strange. A little down the road, they stopped for a quick break to admire the scenery. My granddad was outside looking through his binoculars when my mom remembered him suddenly screaming, get in the car now," in a voice that Mom could only describe as terror. Well, they all got in the car, and my mom remembers seeing this figure. He was in a long purple coat, had long blonde hair, and had a kind face. The scary thing was he didn't seem to be standing. He was hovering a few centimeters above the ground, and when you looked at him, he didn't seem quite there. Like he was half there, half not. Transparent almost. My granddad peeled out and was at full throttle and approaching like 30 miles per hour, but he was still there. At my mom's window, staring in. Not in a scary way, but in a pitiful way. He wasn't running but floating and kept up with the car with no problem. After maybe 2 minutes, if top speed where my granddad got to like 50 miles per hour, he suddenly vanished. Like he was there, then he wasn't. And it's not like he could just leap into the undergrowth because there wasn't any. After that, they spent the rest of the trip asking people about it to see if there were any events in that area. Nobody knew about anything. And recently we looked up the town and showed Mom pictures, and she said it looked nothing alike to what it did on that trip. Also, she looked into it and found there had been other sightings on that stretch of road in the past of a figure exactly as Mom described it, and even people who had drawn pictures of the figure, and every single person drew and described the same figure. Some even speculated it was the ghost of Bonnie Prince Charlie who escaped to safety on that road to the Isle of Skye wearing clothes similar to those described by my mom and other people who had seen it. So yeah, that's my mom's story and a bloody odd one at that, lol. The road was A75 near Kirkcudbright. The A75 is apparently the most haunted road in Scotland, which I forgot about till I looked it up again. When I was around 7 to 8, my family and I were eating at my uncle's house. We loved the city but would go up north to stay with my family nearly every weekend. They lived in a rural village near some hills with cows and horses, etc. I remember asking my dad to let me go out into the street to play with the ball. He granted my request, and by the time I finished, it was around 2300 hours. I played around, but it's important to note that I was playing about 10 meters away from a small area where the cows were sleeping. Suddenly, one of them woke up. It looked at me strangely, and a streetlight flashed into its eyes, casting an eerie stare in my direction. It moved to behind a little tree where it let out a series of a few moos like a cow would intentionally do, but the more it's mooed, the more distorted it sounded like it had a throat problem. I looked back to see its head, it was in weird shape, and I became confused. It started to raise itself up and stand on 2 legs, and I ran back into the house. I screamed, sobbing at my dad, but I couldn't form words. He simply calmed me down and returned to the road to find the cow back in its place, eating grass. My dad said I was fine and that I must have seen stuff, but as we walked back into the house, I looked at the cow, and it looked at me. Now I am older, but I still can't wrap my head around this incident. I still do visit my family up north, with a slight fear. I am a 14-year-old Canadian male, and this happened around a year ago. This story is nothing but the truth. Me and my grandparents are extremely close and have been all my life. So my grandfather is an outdoorsy, get off your phone kind of guy, and he pitched the idea to go camping in early August 2017. I was kind of excited because I don't get outside as often as I should, and I figured it would be some quality time with him. That being said, we weren't going true camping. He wanted to go into the woods. I told him about a nearby campground we could go to. He was still thrilled, so we embarked on our weekend journey. Let me paint you a picture. Our campsite was a dead end aside from the one next to ours. It was right next to the lake. It was beautiful, but to our dismay, we had people right beside us. We did all the camping things, made a fire, went swimming, and even heard the infamous spooky stories around the campfire. We hit the sack around 10 p.m. because there was not much else to do. As soon as my head hit the pillow, it started. The crunching of leaves on our campsite. We thought nothing of it at the time, because the night was still young. Some assholes were setting off fireworks, and others were having a raging party. Hell, even our neighbors were still laughing. I fell asleep for a while. 11 p.m. is when it started to get weird. The party was still on, but our neighbors shut up. So the crunching of leaves didn't make sense. It was consistent, so my guess is the noise was footsteps. No one needed to be on our campsite, so falling asleep was a slightly bigger challenge. My grandpa seemed to be having an even harder time as he seemed to be in alert mode. Yes, I know we are both paranoid, but I feel like that paranoia keeps us safe. I wake up and check my watch. 12 a.m., it reads. It's starting to rain, the water is splashing against the rocks, and the thunder in the distance is quiet enough to sleep with. Even over the sound of rain pattering against our tarp, I still hear the ducking footsteps. The unsettling nature of the situation starts to eat away at me. I wasn't scared, just creeped out. Sleep overcame me, but it didn't come easy. My grandpa finally went to sleep. A crack of thunder woke me again. It's a full-blown thunderstorm now. I felt relieved as I thought the footsteps stopped. Until I heard the thump of wood. I don't know what the person did, but I heard 2 very loud knocks. Followed by 2 large splashes. Duck. This was my only thought as the footsteps continued around our campsite. I stayed still for 2 hours. 5 a.m., daybreak was near, but my heart nearly exploded when I heard someone fumbling with the tent zipper and the fabric. I say the outline of 3 fingers being dragged across the tent. My body shut down as they came closer and stopped when the fabric brushed against my head. Every nerve in my body told me to scream, but I didn't. The hand trailed away, and they became quieter as they left our campsite. I woke my grandfather as soon as the sun came up. Before we left, I went to investigate our site. Lots of the ground was turned into mud in the storm, so the massive boot prints was easily noticeable. Easy to say we dipped the duck out after that. And that was it. Nothing ever became of it aside from the story I can share. Me and my grandpa don't talk about it, and if anything, it brought us closer together. I just want to start this off by saying that I'm a very skeptical person when it comes to paranormal experiences, and I've been in denial about this for quite some time now. This experience happened about a year ago. It was around Halloween, and I was invited to a family diner at my boyfriend's grandparents' house. Deciding to spice things up a little bit for Halloween, I decided to bring my Ouija board with me to play with his cousins and siblings. The house is fairly old, built in the 1900s or something along those lines. It is located in the Rideau Lakes Township, in the town of Smiths Falls. Basically, it's a shithole between Kingston and Ottawa, 2 of Canada's most important cities. Anyways, most people go to bed at around 10 at night, but 5 of us decide to stay up, drink, and play the Ouija board. We set the game up on the kitchen table, we light candles, shut the lights, etc. We begin playing, and almost instantly we start feeling some activity. I took the lead because it was my Ouija board. My first question was a request for her name. The board responded by spelling out May and then Smith. I asked May Smith how old she was, and the pointer slid to 7. I then asked, "Where are you from?" This time, the pointer on the board moves faster, spelling out Cheese Factory extremely quickly. By this point, all of us are shitting ourselves, but all of us promised to each other that we weren't moving it on our own. We began trying it only 2 of us at a time, and still it was the same speed, spelling out Cheese Factory over and over again. I then decide to ask where this cheese factory was, to which she spells out Otter and Creek. At first, we didn't think much of this since Otter Creek doesn't exist in Smiths Falls. However, the name sounded eerily similar to Otter Lake, which was just down the road from the house we were in. I then asked her how she died. She responded by chillingly spelling fire. This must be some kind of joke, and since I was still skeptical, I decided we would try a game. One of us would stop playing, hold a number with our fingers behind our backs, and then May had to use the pointer on the board and tell us which number it was. I go first. I lift my hand off the board, hold 3 fingers behind my back, and wait. I pose the question. The pointer slid super quickly to 3 on the board, and I freeze in fear. This was a huge rectangular table, and everyone else was asleep, so there was literally no way they could have seen. I pull the fingers from behind my back, and everyone thinks I'm messing with them. So, one by one, we try our turn, and each time May points right. Each time, the pointer went to the right number. Still skeptical, I leave the board and go to the kitchen drawers and rearrange the cutlery in them. I take out some of the knives from the drawer and put them by the sink, leaving only 5 knives in the drawer. I ask, May, how many knives are in the drawer? Again, very quickly, the pointer slid to 5. Nobody else could see what was in the drawer but me, and I wasn't touching the board. At this point, we're all basically crapping our pants. I've never believed in the paranormal until that night with the Ouija board. I tried sleeping through the night, but I was terrified. I barely got 3 hours of sleep. I ignored this until recently, until I was bored and decided to look up her name. I came upon the Smiths Falls Cemetery archives, where I found 2 results for May Smith, Ella Mae Smith and May Victoria Smith. Ella Mae Smith passed away at age 85, but May Victoria Smith has no record on the web. I plan on visiting the grave soon to maybe learn more about who they were. During my search, I also stumbled upon another website run by the Rideau Lakes Townships. I shit my pants today when I read the Otter Creek Cheese Factory, which was a building that supposedly burned down in 1940. The address of the old cheese factory, which is now a private residence, isn't even 15 minutes from the house we were at, and it was located in Otter Lake. So, I'm assuming Otter Lake must have been renamed to Otter Creek. There was no way for any of us to know about the cheese factory, as none of us are from the area. None of us even knew where Otter Lake was until recently. The thought of May Smith still haunts me today, and my heart aches at the knowledge that maybe we really did talk to a poor girl who died in a fire through that board. I never believed in the paranormal, but this changed my outlook forever. Hit me up if you have similar experiences or know the Smith family history. This was on Halloween 2014. I'll never forget it. It was about 6 in the evening, and the sun was starting to set. My father, older brother, and I always go to a park that is pretty small in comparison to other parks I usually see around the Metroplex. I guess people are attracted to its intimate setting because it's usually fairly populated. Anyways, there is a steep trail of woods behind the park, and it's pretty dense. A community exists up there that not too many people know about. Legend has it that they used to have a cult residing there and sacrificed small children in the woods in the 1970s, and it stopped when the police got involved and captured several members. So feeling in the mood to get scared, my father, brother, and I hike it up, and not too far in the woods do I see a drawing of a little kid on a tree. It wasn't a picture that was pinned to the bark or anything, it was drawn onto the actual bark itself. Figuring this weird, we continue venturing until we come across another strange setting. This time we see a shirt with bloodstains tied around a tree branch in a knot and a wooden chair with 2 of the legs sawed off and a roll of duct tape. My brother starts shitting himself and wants to leave, but being the brave stupid souls that my father and I are, we continue. When we're deep in the woods, we see a tent with no one inside of it. Near the tent is a table with 2 chairs, seated directly across from one another. And sitting directly above it was a drawing of a skull with horns on a cardboard box that was attached to a tree. Needless to say, I armed myself with a large, thick stick I found, and we took the shortcut out of there. We checked our backs every time. I was around 10 to 11 years old when this happened, old enough to stay home alone but not old enough to recognize some red flags. Over the summer, I attended camp, following the typical 8 to 3 routine. My house sits close to the end of my street, which forms a U, but for some reason the bus driver would never drop me off at my house. I would always get dropped off at the end of my street, where I would toddle myself along back home. Both my parents worked late hours, sometimes not getting home until 8 p.m., and it would be very expensive to hire a babysitter for 4 to 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So, starting 6th grade, when the bus dropped me off at home, I would be by myself. I'd do the usual middle school routine, play games online and watch TV. Occasionally my neighbor's cat would come into my backyard, and I would feed and pet her as a way to get outside. The only computer in the house was in my dad's workroom, which has a window overlooking the deck and a window overlooking the side of the house. We have large bay windows in the living room, dining room, and kitchen of my house, and since we sit on a hill, you can pretty much see the entire backyard from a nice vantage point. So most days when I got home, I'd toss off my backpack and go right to that room, and you could see me walk from my front door and pop up by the computer from outside. Unfortunately, this would lead to something that I had forgotten about up until now. When I got off the bus, I did as expected, go into my dad's workroom and play computer games. About 30 minutes into this, I can hear faint meowing coming from the outside window. I pause the game and look outside, thinking maybe my neighbor's cat had wandered over. Nothing. I just sat back down and resumed playing, only to hear meowing again. It was quiet, but noticeable, and so I checked the other window. Nothing again. This routine happened for a beneficial 10 minutes, and eventually I got frustrated and went into the living room to watch TV. Not even 2 minutes later, meowing from the window I was sitting right beside. Now I was confused and a little creeped out, so I shut the blinds and kept trying to watch TV. The meows continued, but only when they came from the window right behind me did I jump and leave the living room, officially skeeved. I went into my bedroom, where the blinds were down but still cracked for some sunlight. I tried to read a book, only to hear a meow come from outside my bedroom window. This was enough to make me call my dad, concerned that maybe the cat was hurt, but I couldn't see it to be sure. He said he'd have the neighbor check it out and call me back later. 10 minutes go by, and I get a call from my dad saying he was coming home from work. Nothing urgent in his voice, just that his job had gotten cancelled and he could come home early. I thought nothing of it, and when he got home, I realized the cat noises had stopped. Fast forward to the present, and I asked my dad about the strange incident, thinking it was funny the cat had followed me around. What he told me next made my blood run cold. After I called him, my neighbor did indeed come to check on the house. What he found were large footprints, leading in circles all around the house, clustered close to the walls so that even if I looked outside, I wouldn't see anything. Someone had been stalking me through my house, seeing where I was through the windows, and making cat noises to try and get me to come outside. They must have known I was home alone, since it was simple to see me walk by myself down the street and let myself in. My neighbor immediately called my dad and searched the property, but found no one. The police weren't called since there were nothing but footprints that led off into the woods and got lost, and I never saw anyone. My dad stayed home with me for the rest of the week. It sickens me to know that there are people who would use these tactics to try and lure kids out of their homes, and from there, do whatever they wanted with them. This happened about 5 years ago, back when I was going through hard times and was homeless. I used to live in Denver, Colorado, which is where this took place. There are several cemeteries in the Denver area, but there's one on the outskirts of Denver that's very large and very old. I think it may be the oldest one that's still being actively used. Before I became homeless, I didn't know much about this area. I had always gotten a creepy feeling around there but didn't know why until I was on the streets. After that, I heard from many different people that it's got lots of underground tunnels, and some homeless people live in these tunnels. But in the deeper tunnels, there is cult activity. These tunnels have secret entrances all over the area, and the homeless that live around this area avoid some of these spider holes because people have been known to disappear near them. Mostly women. This area has a river going through it, alongside the graveyard. One side of the river has a darker feel than the other. It's eerie over there and smells like death. Anyways, one time, I was wandering the area with a few other acquaintances, safety in numbers and all that. We had nowhere to go and decided to hang out in the abandoned part of the graveyard, the older side. It had just gotten dark, and it was windy. It was also fall, so it was cold. We were huddled up against gravestones to block the wind. One of the people I was with knew the area better than me, and he had warned me to be very vigilant. I figured this was so we didn't attract the attention of security, police, or fellow homeless, but I later found out why he was so anxious about the area. It was probably around 10 p.m. We had sort of all been just sitting in silence, trying to stay warm, hoping the night passed quickly when I heard my acquaintance, let's call him Jay, whisper, "Hey, heads up. Keep quiet." I had already been quiet, but I immediately tensed up, assuming he spotted security or something. But as I looked around, I saw in the distance some small, flickering lights, appearing here and there all around the graveyard. It's like people had been spread all around the large graveyard, and they were all holding lighters that they flicked on, which only then showed they were all over. After my eyes adjusted a bit, I recognized they seemed to be candles. I looked harder and could sort of see the outlines of people holding these candles. Jay whispered, "We gotta go." We clumsily started grabbing the few items we had around us. Jay came right up next to me and said, "Follow me, and don't look at them." I was thinking, WTF? Me and our other friend quickly started following Jay, moving at a quick walk straight to the break in the fence where we had come in. I was stupid enough to look behind me and saw the lights and figures continuing to appear all around us, and they were walking to the middle of the graveyard to stand in a circle. I passed by a few and saw out of the corner of my eye that they were wearing black cloaks. I could feel the menacing presence and stares, like they were daring me to look at them, but I had an overwhelming feeling that if we left them alone, they would leave us alone. One thing that haunted me afterwards was the way they seemed to move towards the middle. They moved quickly and smoothly, like they were gliding, a stereotype, I know, and just seemed to morph out of the darkness. My instincts were on high alert. I knew whoever they were pure evil. We got the hell out of there, and once we got to the fence, we quickly sprinted for a few blocks. Jay didn't explain much, he just said to avoid those people and don't look them in the eye, or they could have power over you. I definitely had gotten that feeling from the encounter. I asked why they weren't scared of cops or security, and he said basically that they got away with stuff they did because the authorities didn't want to risk looking into it because they didn't want to be targeted. I don't know how true this is, but I do know what I saw and felt. So, this isn't really a story, but I can't help but wonder about the strange house across the street. I first started paying attention to it when my aunt moved in. The previous owner left behind pictures of a woman, a man, and a child, and it looked as if there were burn marks on the ceiling. It felt eerie, I guess. Sometimes I would see someone looking out from the second-story window, or I would hear small voices. Once, I was spending the night and saw a little girl. I tried to talk to her, but she only smiled and ran away. My aunt and her boyfriend fought a lot, and they eventually split and moved out. Another family moved in, and months later they divorced and moved away. The same thing happened with the next family. In for a few months, out after a divorce. By this time, my family and I were referring to it as the cursed house. We'd make bets on how long the newest family would last. It was usually around 3 months. By far the strangest occurrence was the family that just ran away one night. They left with no explanation, food still cooking on the stove, furniture left behind. They just upped and left and never came back. We actually have some of their old furniture. The landlord was throwing it out, so might as well, right? I've always wondered what they must have seen to make them run and leave everything behind. The next family divorced pretty quickly, but the woman stayed in the house. She actually still lives there. I thought the curse might have faded, or maybe the spirits there have calmed, but sometimes my sisters and I still see someone watching us from the second-story window. When I was younger, every year for Christmas I would drive upstate to my aunt's house along a stretch of highway. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of this road, all I know is it runs nearby Akron, NY, at some point. However, most of the drive is through rural areas with little to no towns nearby. So it was the dead of night, and my groggy self had gotten off a long shift and had to drag my ass to my aunt's house since my extended family was expecting me the following morning. Near halfway through the drive, I realized I was low on gas, which irritated me. My brother told me he had filled it up the day before, so he either forgot or was straight lying. I saw an archaic-looking sign for a gas station off the next road. It wasn't an official road sign, literally a pole with a slab of metal attached with gas off next exit or something along those lines painted on. That seemed a little sketchy, but people do the same thing with fruit stands on highways, so whatever. I pulled off the next exit on some dilapidated country-ass road through dense woods. The whole thing was creepy and surreal. I kept expecting Leatherface to come running out of the trees with a chainsaw. Anyway, eventually I came to the gas station and realized quickly it hadn't been open for years. It was all rusted, and the convenience store's roof was caved in. The gas pumps had all been taken out as well. I pulled over next to it and checked my gauge. I would probably only make it another half mile before running out, so I called AAA, and they said they'd send a truck over. Now I'm playing the waiting game. I left my engine on because when the headlights were off everything was pitch black and my paranoid self wasn't sitting next to an abandoned gas station in the middle of a forest in complete darkness. So most of the wait went uneventful until I sensed movement around the side of the old store, where my lights are pointed. I look up but don't see anything more, so I look back down at my phone. Then, over the sounds of the night, I hear someone yell, "Hey buddy! Come here," in a demanding tone. I look up, and I shit you not, there's a dude standing by the old store, looking towards me, illuminated by my headlights. He looked like a run-of-the-mill homeless guy. I was honestly spooked and figured he must have been squatting there. Still watching him, I rolled down my window and yelled something like, "Yeah, what's up?" Still mentally crapping myself. I had my foot ready to floor it out of there at the first sign of trouble. "You got any change?" "Nah, I don't, sorry man." I looked up at him. He has this kind of vacant expression and stands stiff. Then I see more movement. There are heads. About 20 or so heads, peeking around trees beyond the man I'm talking to. I can't see them clearly at all, but they are definitely people. Literally just heads, staring in my directions from around the trees. I see another guy beginning to walk from around the gas station, and then I turned around and sped off. I got as far away from that place as my tank could carry me and updated AAA on my location. The driver came back over and filled me up, and I didn't say anything. But after he left, I wanted to call the cops, so I called the nearest town's sheriff department. They said they'd send a trooper over, and I gave them the location. When I got to my aunt's house, they called me back and said whoever was there was gone, but they could tell a large number of people had been living there for a while. Blankets, canned food, the usual. The whole situation still freaks me out, but frankly, I can consider myself lucky. I'll always have such a creepy story to tell. I'm just glad nothing awful happened. When I was the age of 15, I had a room in my parents' basement, and like any normal teenager who smokes pot and listens to metal, my room windows were foiled up so that even at noon it was pitch black. Now a little backstory of me in this house. Firstly, when it comes to entities, I rarely see them. However, I can sense them when they come around or I happen to stumble upon their domain. It starts with a small, uneasy feeling beginning where your soul would be if you believed in that and just gradually increases, and depending on the nature of the ghost, if it's any form of negative and can result in sinister actions, my feeling that grows within becomes acute paranoia to full-blown manic episodes. If they are passive or non-violent, there is an uneasy feeling at first that subsides into a calm, peaceful relaxation. The house I lived in when I saw him is a comfortable house despite the fact there is no insulation in the basement my room, so it can get a bit nippy. The sweet old man that owned it before us passed away peacefully in his sleep, and if I recall, it was like 3 or 4 days before his son found him. Now here is where it gets tricky. I have sensed the prior owner numerous times and always with a warm greeting feeling. However, coming back to me being 15 in my secluded room of darkness, I awoke to a very puzzling awakening. My room was pitch black at the time, but the figure standing at the foot of my bed was even darker. This man, and I say male because the silhouette of him was broad-shafted with an aggressive but stationary stance, was at least 6 feet 5 inches tall. In the dark, I can make his body out easily, that's how black he was. And at this moment, I knew we were looking each other in the eyes, if he had any. No, it is not the Hat Man. But a shadow person, if you must, then okay, that's what he is. Anyways, we locked stairs for what seems like 10 minutes. I am not able to move, yell, or even whimper, that's how frozen in fear my body was. Finally, I get the ability to sit up in bed and reach for the string that pulls the light switch on, find it, and the moment the light illuminates my room, I am staring at my room with everything that belongs to me and no man. I have never seen him since, and I am almost 34 now. But I still continue to sense other entities but never him. I hope our paths never cross again because I don't think he will be as polite as the first time. This happened in the Amazonas, on the border between Brazil and Peru. The jungle's an amazing place to live, everyone knew each other, and I had a big group of friends of different ages. The only horrible part of the Amazon is the existence of terrorist groups that try to control the region. I was 7 when this happened. Every kid in the village knew we had freedom to go anywhere, as long as it wasn't close to the terrorists, and that we could never leave the village at night. My parents taught me since I was very little how to hide in case something happens and to run if I see things getting dangerous. I remember all the adults of the village were celebrating something. I think it was an Amazonian party like Halloween. I remember my mother painting her face in a tribal way, and all the children went together to a house to stay safe and have fun. The eldest girl was in charge. She was 17 years old, and as soon as our parents left, she ignored us and left with her friends. Our closest group consisted of 6 children. I was one of the youngest ones, and we all listened to the most adventurous one, Leon, who was 14. Whatever Leon said, we followed because he was fun, always making challenges, and he knew how to take care of us. Yes, despite him being reckless, he was our friend. We loved him and knew he would never abandon us if something happened. After playing soccer and eating, the 6 of us become bored. Carla, one of the 6, had the idea to dress up like our parents did, with tribal makeup and dresses. We agreed, and soon we were all dressed up like the kids who lived in the village of the deepest regions of the Amazon. I remember us playing around until Leon said too, and I quote, "Let's explore the Amazon and find a hidden treasure." We all cheered and agreed to leave. It was easy to escape since the girl who was supposed to take care of us left us. Leon managed to find a lantern and a boat big enough for us 6, so we decided to sail. It was around midnight, but we didn't care. Just imagine 6 kids dressed up on a boat, splashing water everywhere, and trying to find an imaginary treasure. No phones, no adults, just the jungle and us. It was life at its purest. Everything seemed to be perfect, until we hear people calling, "Who's there?" We saw a lighted boat approaching. Quickly, Leon dropped the lantern and instructed us to lay down on the boat's floor and stay very still. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. I remember clearly how we were all with our bellies to the floor, grabbing our hands and not even daring to breathe. But it was too late. "Stop hiding, I see you," a voice said as the guy illuminated our boat. We stood up, and I saw 4 men with guns, and I'm not talking about small pistols, pointing at us. They laughed and said, "They're a bunch of children." Leon put himself in front and said that we were in a hurry because our parents were expecting us home. The biggest guy, who had a red bandana, laughed again and said, "Little kids should not be here alone at night, you could disappear in the jungle and no one will ever find you." At this point, I was super scared, and Carla started crying. "You can go, you're just tribe Wawa," which means baby in Quechua. They then left. I remember all of us hugging each other, crying, and sailing as fast as we could. Once we got home, we entered the house and closed all doors and windows. We all slept together on the floor, but before that, we agreed not to tell this to anyone in the village, not the elders or our parents. Even now, no one knows what happened that night. Years later, I understood why they let us go. They thought we were kids from the local tribe. We had no value to them. If they had known where they were dressed up and were from the village, I probably wouldn't be sharing this story. I was driving to work for 5 hours. It was already dark. After about 3 hours of driving, I started to get tired. I bought myself coffee and some snacks at a gas station and went on. But snacks and coffee can only keep you awake for so long, and I started to feel worn out again. This part of the road was nothing but thick, dark pinewood forest around me. No other cars on the road, nothing, only insects smashing my windshield now and then and an empty road. I was now extremely tired, and at one point, I nearly drove off the road, almost falling asleep. I have to sleep now, I can't wait for a gas station. I need to stop as soon as I see a place where I can park my car, anything. When I'm tired, I fall asleep really fast. If I'm worn out enough, I can fall asleep in the middle of a sentence when I'm talking, so it's a bit urgent for me to find a place where I can stop. It felt like an hour, but probably just 5 minutes go by, and I spot this little pocket in the road. It's like a parking space for quick stops, like peeing, switching drivers, or stuff like that, not even a real resting area. I stopped here, turned down my windows to check if I heard any weird noises, total silence, and turned up the windows again. Nothing catastrophic is going to happen. I haven't seen a car for like 30 minutes, and this road is empty. If someone is checking out my car, I bet it is the cops checking on me if I'm alright. I leave my keys in the apartment, and I lock the doors, just to be safe. I adjust my seat a bit to make it more comfortable to sleep in, and I take off my shoes and put them on the passenger seat on the right. It is so nice to close my eyes, and I instantly fall asleep. I don't know why, but something wakes me up. I can't really see anything. Some kind of bright light hits me in the eyes. First I thought it was a flashlight, but then I realized it is the high beams from another car in my rearview mirror that are blinding me. I look in my left mirror, and I see a dude walking up beside my car. Maybe he wants help with something? Should I make it clear to him that I'm in here? He is right beside my left back door. Should he walk out and ask what he is doing? I didn't have to. The dude proceeds to jerk and pull on my left back door. I almost shit my ducking pants when I realize that he is trying to force his way into my car. My seat is adjusted for me to lay down, and I pushed it back max. I can't reach the pedals, which makes it impossible for me to drive my car. I slam the car horn, breaking the silence with a roar, and the dude jumps. That gives me like 2 seconds to push my seat to reach the pedals, but it's still way out of adjustment, so I'm kind of pulling myself to the steering wheel because my seat is lying flat and isn't supporting my back. Anyway, I start my car and drive off, with a cloud of smoke from my screeching tires. It's hard driving a car with nothing holding up your upper body, but I managed. As I leave, I look in the rear mirror, and I can see how the dude stands there and looks at me, and I can see 2 more guys coming up beside him. What I can see in the silhouette of their beams is that one of them has something in his hand, like a wrench or crowbar. I drove super fast, way over the speed limit. My whole body was trembling with adrenaline and fear. I drove like that for like 30 minutes, then I stopped at a gas station to fix my seat and put my shoes on again. I figured out I was only sleeping for like 10 minutes. Well, I didn't have to sleep until I got to my destination, which is surrounded by heavy-duty fencing and the building has an alarm. I told my boss the next day, and he said they actually have problems with what we call it in Sweden, road pirates. Criminals that force you to stop on the road and rob you of everything, including your car. In that specific area. It could just be 3 nice dudes that wanted to check if I was okay. Then why didn't they just knock in my driver's window? The thing in his hand could be a big flashlight. Be safe. I work at a zoo in my hometown. It's a nice zoo, and we're pretty popular. And a pretty impressive selection of animals. Lions, tigers, rhinos, but also red pandas, red river hogs, Victorian pigeons, wallabies, and more. One of my favorite attractions is this big indoor aviary guests can walk through. We have all kinds of birds, some tortoises, a turtle, and even an iguana in there who have pretty interesting personalities. Recently, there have been some strange occurrences. I'm not sure when they started, but the oldest story I heard was about a month ago. One of the keepers was in the morning replacing the feeding stations for the birds. He said he started hearing something strange. It sounded like some kind of socializing, but like none he had ever heard. He's worked in there for ages and basically raised some of these birds. He knows them well. It's kind of scary how accurate he can be. He was able to determine the calls were coming from on top of an artificial rock thing where we hide some equipment and controls for the building. None of the birds go up there because they are afraid of the motor for the waterfall. Unsurprisingly, when he went up there, he found nothing. Multiple of the night guards have heard things in there, and 2 have seen very tall figures standing up in this area. One guard said he was sitting just outside and heard the sounds. He went in worried one of the birds was hurt because it sounded really strange. Going in, he was excited about this artificial cave we have that's under the rock thing, and he can hear light steps on top. He slowly steps out with his taser out, looking up there. He says he saw a figure, maybe a right-feeling tall humanoid, and starts to put over the aviary, looking around with a hunched posture. He said they didn't see him, but he left and called the cops. They searched the building, then the whole zoo, and nothing. The second guard had a similar experience, but the thing did seem to see them, but there were also 2 this time. Apparently, they threw something like a rock at her, but she couldn't find what they tossed at her. Unfortunately, and much to many of the staff's frustration for other reasons besides paranormal, the zoo has yet to set up any cameras in the building. But one of the cameras that are outside has picked up the sound once when it was particularly loud. Unfortunately, I'm just an admissions staffer, so I don't have access to those cameras. However, as we move into the off-season, the encounters have become so common that the administration is taking notice. Our own CEO heard it. Recently there have been several items thrown at staff and guests. A bird was found dead like something squeezed to death. It was horrible, especially since the bird was such a sweet and well-known little fellow, and lots of sounds. I know there are more, but to include all the stories would take forever. I have 2 experiences. My first was pretty basic, but as I heard the vocalization, it was really strange and very loud. The scariest part was how all the birds went dead silent, while the ground birds all went and hid. They aren't afraid of loud sounds normally, so that kind of freaked me out. The next was more interesting. I was walking through early in the morning, and I got to the enclosure where we hold the iguana. Our iguana is pretty old and a pretty chill animal who has been at the zoo his whole life. He is such a sweet little animal, and I love him to death. His enclosure is pretty open, as the only separation is this sturdy net over some bars. It keeps the birds from picking on him mostly. I walk over, and the section of the net that is against the rock thing is being stretched up and onto it into the foliage. It seemed like someone was trying to rip off the top. I can't see what's pulling it, and when Holler asks who is up there, it springs back and there's no sound. I radio security, and wait, there is no way off that I wouldn't be able to see who was up there if they tried getting down, or in the unlikely event, up. When security arrives, they scan the area but find nothing. We check on the iguana, and he is a bit stressed but seems no worse for wear. Incidences are still going on as I speak. Today I walked through and heard a call. I actually had to stop typing this because something just shoved a metal shelf off the top of there, so definitely something is happening in there. And something very active. I don't know what else to say. I want to say it's a poltergeist, but it's so vocal and active. And the shadowy figures have been seen multiple times, so I'm wondering if they're very active shadow figures. Thoughts and questions are welcome. This happened to me one night, around 2003. It was very late at night. I was walking into my room at about 1 a.m. I went to turn on my light and realized my bulb had burned out, so I just proceeded to get ready for bed. The room was eerily quiet, not the normal type of silence. I thought nothing of it at the time. Just before I climbed into bed, my eyes focused in the dark, and I caught a glimpse of my cat's tail on the opposite side of the bed on the floor. It was sticking straight up and was puffed up, and he was making this really odd sound, which almost sounded like a child screaming no. No. My cat then bolted out of the room with a hiss. This startled me enough to get a flashlight and check out my room. In the closet, under the bed, even under my bed sheets. Nothing was there, so I dismissed it as my cat just freaking himself out. Fast forward to about 3:30 a.m. My cat had apparently come to lay with me sometime in the night. I knew this, as at this time, I felt my cat jump awake, startled against my leg, followed by a dull thud from within my room. He again started making those no sounds and darted from the room. At first, I was going to just dismiss it as I did before, but what followed truly shook me badly. Just before I started to close my eyes again, I heard, clear as day, a high-pitched cackling laugh, almost like that of a witch you might see here at Halloween, trailing out of my room, and the sound of footfalls on the floor. My heart racing, I jumped up and grabbed the flashlight next to my bed and headed out into the hallway toward the living room. There was my cat, on a chair, crouched into a corner of it, staring at the wall and then at me. His eyes wide, as clearly something frightened him. But there was nothing there. I went over and picked him up. He was shaking and mewing like a kitten. I again looked about the room, went into the kitchen, into the bathroom. Nothing anywhere. I took my cat back into my room with me, and out of habit, I flicked the light switch even though I knew it burned out. But, to my shock, the bulb turned on, lighting my room brightly. I didn't get any more sleep that night. Just sat up in bed, my kitty on my lap being comforted by my petting him. I still to this day have no explanation as to what took place that night and what manner of event, or entity, terrified my poor pet. It never happened again after that. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting university. Our home was, and still is, just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forests well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water, it goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. I never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Yeah, I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyway, so what the hell? I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was for a collar. I kept moving, and the bell started moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. A blooming dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, and so had I. So, the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while I was walking that way. I suppose, dunno really. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bollocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked, Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body up after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it, so, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me, not animals? I looked around and started running. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shook out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raised despite being soaked. It was dark, I jogged as fast as I could, and I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining, every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud, like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was traveling with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out, and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walking thing again because I was out of breath. Then, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me, a tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I fkin didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied, I'm on the phone with the police, they are on the path. Dad, I can see you, I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard, and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. On Halloween night, when I was around 12 or 11, I stayed up late on my Switch with my headphones plugged in. It was late, at least midnight, so I decided to go get water in our outside fridge that was in the garage. I have to mention my parents had friends sleeping in the trailer outside. So the door was unlocked to go into the garage just in case they came inside during the night for whatever reason. When I got out of my room to go get the water, I brought my Switch with me with my headphones plugged in. Right before I got to the garage door, I decided to turn off my Switch and take my headphones off. I had no reason to do this, and it's not something I'd normally do at that age, but it might as well be the reason I'm here today. When I put my hand on the garage door handle, now with my ears free, I heard a loud crash in the garage. My body went cold. It felt like I was made out of white noise, but I didn't freeze. I calmly checked the door handle by turning it slowly as to not make noise, and once I realized it was unlocked, I locked it quickly. Right as I locked it, the door handle started to turn and rattled rapidly 4 times. I ran to my parents' room and knocked loudly, effectively making them both wake up. They asked me what was wrong through the door, and I said, "Please tell me one of you is outside in the garage." My dad answered no, and after I told him what happened, he said it was most likely their friends wanting to come in and told me to unlock it. Believing them, I went outside. With a kitchen knife, I watched enough horror to be careful. The next morning my parents asked their friends if it was them to find out that not only did they hear someone trip and whisper duck, but none of them left the trailer that night, and I had effectively stopped and scared off an intruder. That door is now always locked at night. When I was 5, my sister was 7, my parents got divorced, and my mom took us to stay with my grandparents. The first night we slept over, I couldn't fall asleep. I was still trying to process my parents splitting up. I watched the bedroom door creak open, and a tall black figure floated in. It stopped at the foot of my bed, turned to look at me, and I noticed it had red, glowing eyes. I fainted from fear and woke up the next morning too afraid to say anything to my family. More random things would continue to happen, such as watching glowing eyes run past the door at night. When we finally got our own place and moved out, I remember my sister and I packing and playing on the boxes. Then her face went pale, and she wasn't laughing or playing anymore and refused to talk to me. When we moved out, we went to a big house in Weyawega. My sister and I were about 7 and 10 now. My sister and I had identical rooms upstairs. Weird shit happened shortly after moving there too. We would hear something slapping the radiator in the hallway all night and would come home from school to find our toys rearranged, lined up, and facing the door waiting for us to walk in. One morning I woke up with my arm burning, only for me to look at the floor and see all of my toys lined up on the floor facing me. I looked at my arm and found needles sticking out of it. I ran to my mom, and she helped remove the needles as she told me her experiences as well. She said her room was always cold enough to see her breath, even during the summer. She went on to tell me about the stain in the hallway. Since we moved in, I remember there being almost like a mold stain about as tall as her, 6 feet, and she would scrub it constantly, but it always came back. She said she had a maintenance man come check for leaks in the roof or water damage, but he found no such thing. There was no cause for the stain. It was in the shape of a person only on the wallpaper. The wood behind the wallpaper was perfectly fine though. And that the bathroom door would fly open while she peed. A few months go by, and I go to take a shower in the upstairs bathroom. I lock the door, but midway through my shower, I hear the doorknob rattle violently. I yell that I'll be out shortly, but it doesn't stop until I reach to open it. When I opened it, I saw what looked like a humanish figure crouched in the hallway, with a face that looked to be sewn together with different colored skins. Its sharp teeth hung out of its mouth as it opened slightly when it saw me. I slammed the door after realizing it had red eyes, just like before, and I screamed for my sister. The first time I saw him, it was too dark. This time I saw it partially illuminated, and I saw its face. She came running to ask if I was okay. She had to walk me to my room after I calmed down. Shortly before we moved out, it was a week before Halloween. I came home just at dark, and I would park my bike along the fence that ran along the driveway. Our backyard was all mud and totally enclosed by fences. I left my bike near my stepdad's truck and was about to head inside when I heard a metallic bang come from the truck. It was too dark to see anything, but I walked towards it to see if it was my stepdad playing a prank. As I stepped towards it, I felt a breath on my face and heard a whisper of a male voice say, come here, I won't hurt you." I screamed and ran up the stairs of the porch. I put my back to the door and tried to look for where the voice came from. Instead, all I heard were footsteps quickly heading towards me, and I felt the breath again on my face as it whispered a little louder now, come here. I ran inside, locking the doors behind me, and I must have made so much noise that my sister came downstairs to see me panting and pale standing in the living room. She asked if I was okay, and when I told her what happened, she called our mom. Our mom got home a little later and searched the yard with a bat looking for any sign. She found nothing. The next morning, the police were there, searching the yard and asking me questions. They told me they only saw my footprints in the mud and no one else, but they could tell where I started running just from the mark I left in the ground. We moved again thinking it would help, but we moved to a trailer about an hour away, and weird things started happening shortly after again. We were about 16 and 18 now, but things just kept happening. We would see shadows run through the kitchen and duck down behind the chairs. My sister was on a Zoom call with her girlfriend, and when the girlfriend told my sister, "Don't turn around," my sister did anyway only to see all of the clothes drop from their hangers all at once. The girlfriend said she saw the clothes swinging and told her not to turn around just before they fell. My sister moved out because of this, and my boyfriend moved in. Just before she left, we talked in the kitchen about all the weird shit that had happened. I told her about the first time I saw red eyes at our grandparents' house. She turned pale. She then told me what happened the day we moved out of our grandparents'. Turns out, while we were playing on the boxes, she looked at the doorway and saw a black mass walk past that had spikes coming out of its back and a red glow to its face. She ducking saw him too. I was dumbfounded. We never told each other because we both thought we were crazy, but we both saw the same thing, but she noticed it in the daylight. When she moved out, my boyfriend and I took over her old room. My boyfriend told me for the first time in his life he suffered sleep paralysis. He saw a skeleton-like woman holding him down while being nose to nose. He squeaked out to help me but wasn't able to wake me up in time. Odd things kept happening, but when I got pregnant with my daughter, it slowed until she was born. She was nearly a year old when I placed her on the floor in the living room while I went to pee. When I got back, she was chewing on something. When I got it out of her mouth, I realized it was a hospital band. I have no idea where she got it. She was still in the same place I left her, and I knew it wasn't there before I walked away. I looked up the woman from the band and found out she lived in the trailer before us. She died of cancer in the trailer. I wondered if this was who my boyfriend was seeing hold him down at night. Before we finally moved out of there, BF and I listened one night as footsteps went up and down the hallway to our room all night. It would walk to our door, scratch at it a few times, then walk back. It did so for nearly 2 hours straight. We live in a new trailer now, and I have 2 kids. About a year after moving into our new trailer, I woke up one night in a cold sweat. As I sat up, I saw a dark figure at the foot of the bed again, then another on my side of the bed, and a third behind my boyfriend on his side of the bed. I froze and watched for a minute, but then I heard my boyfriend say, "Tell them I don't like it when they stand behind me." I was done. I got him fully awake, and we ran out of our room to check on the kids. I got all the sage in the house, opened all the windows, and filled the house with sage smoke till it felt safe again. Now my kids are 8 and 6. But since they were little, they started waking up crying, telling me a man with red eyes touched them while they slept. He's still here, my kids see him too, and he's after them now. About 2 years ago, I moved from my college town in Arizona to Woodland Hills, California, for my new job, no longer living there. I was 21 and living alone in a studio within 2 blocks of an outdoor mall and gym. The apartments were older, built in the mid-70s, but well maintained with a fence and cameras around the entire complex and gated entrances. It was a fairly nice area, mostly young professionals and families, and felt pretty safe. After this incident, I refused to leave my apartment complex alone after dark. One night I decided to walk following my workout. It was barely nightfall and still fairly warm. I grabbed my water bottle and started walking past the gym in the opposite direction of my apartment. I walked for a little while, turned around, and started walking home. That's when I noticed a white Escalade with completely blacked out windows that had previously passed me. They drove down to the light and made the turn, so I thought nothing of it. Only when I saw the car for the 3rd time did I start to panic. By this point it was well past dark, and most people were headed home from the gym and the outdoor mall. I was still a few blocks from the gym, and the car kept driving past, slowing down, and speeding back up if they saw anyone around. I cut through a parking lot to try to get to the closest store open, a McDonald's. Before I knew it, the Escalade was back and in the parking lot, between me and the McDonald's. The car started slowly circling the parking lot, and the windows rolled down partway to reveal 3 men in their 30s-40s just staring at me. At that point I was frozen and decided to stand under a light by a closed store while frantically trying to call my friend from the apartment complex to come get me, my mom, friends from other states, anyone, so I wasn't as alone. The Escalade kept circling, slowing down to barely an idle every time they passed me. I saw the door of McDonald's open and a younger guy come out, clearly done with his shift, and headed to his car. I started yelling for him to wait, and I needed help and took off running towards him. The Escalade sped out of the parking lot, back to the nearest light, and turned again. I apologized to the younger guy for scaring him and asked if he could please walk me to my gym, thinking the men were probably gone and I could wait a few minutes there before walking back to my apartment. We got to the gym, and he made sure I felt safe there before going back to his car. I waited for 10 minutes, still trying to reach my friend who lived in my complex so he could come get me. I wasn't able to get a reply from him, so I called one of my girlfriends from back home to talk and started walking the rest of the way home. I got past the main intersection before the car turned down my road and started following me again. My heart sank, and I had a horrible feeling that if I didn't get inside the gate before they got to me, I'd never be seen again. I broke into a sprint and screamed into my phone that I'm being followed and for my friend not to hang up. The gate had just started to close behind another resident's car, and I barreled through it, sprinting the full way back to my apartment and locking the door. About 3 hours later, I went to take my dog to go potty before bed, and out of curiosity, or sheer stupidity, I walked back towards the gate I came running through, still safe within the fence. I saw the Escalade parked on the other side of the road, waiting just outside the camera's field of view. I calmly turned and walked my dog on the interior of the apartment complex, out of their sight. They came back to the same spot every night for several days, and then I never saw them again. When I was about 8 years old, my parents were going through a divorce, and I and my older sister used to spend a lot of time at our grandparents' house. It's a long, ranch-style home on a corner in a lovely neighborhood that's a 10-minute walk from a gas station, grocery store, and a few fast food restaurants. The streets are long and lined with well-manicured houses cradled by big, scenic California valley hills all around. We were never very wealthy, but my grandpa bought it as a fixer-upper many years ago, and the property value has skyrocketed since then. As you can imagine, it's a very safe spot, and although there weren't many other kids in the neighborhood, it wasn't uncommon to see neighbors walking their dogs or pushing a stroller down the sidewalk outside our house. Although my mom was extremely protective all our lives, this particular neighborhood was densely populated, and my family knew just about everyone who lived there. She grew up in that neighborhood herself, so she was understandably trusting. She would once in a while let me and my sister walk to the Rotten Robbie gas station on the other end of the block to grab a snack. I would always get a ring pop, and my sister would grab a Three Musketeers before we made our way back home. My sister was about 11 at the time, and this small amount of freedom was a huge deal to us. Nothing compared to walking down that street all by ourselves in the summertime, laughing and joking around, a couple dollar bills in our pockets. I felt like I owned the world. The one oddity I ever noticed around the neighborhood was a small camper parked on the side of the road opposite to the gas station, right along the backside of the fence of another house. It sat there in the shade like a permanent fixture, all the windows constantly covered by opaque beige curtains. I can't explain why, but it always gave me this deep sense of foreboding when I'd pass it. I was almost positive someone was living inside it because, at times, I'd hear the air conditioning running as it sat stagnant in that same spot. The hairs on my neck would always stand on end as I passed it, particularly as I passed the camper door, and I'd always keep an eye on it for the fear that one day it'd swing open just as I came to pass by. I think what bothered me the most was a drawing taped to the door from the inside. It was extremely messy, a sketch of odd lines in a brown-colored pencil that was frustratingly indiscernible. I could see the outline of something, a vague shape, but could never make out what it was intended to be. I never had the nerves to stop and stare long enough to really investigate, but each time I walked by, I'd steal a glance. A year prior to the incident I'm about to describe, I was walking with my mom past the camper in the shade. We had just gone to the park nearby and, unfortunately, had to pass the camper before we could cross the street and continue walking. I didn't want to seem afraid, so I kept on walking right behind her and didn't object when she walked past it. This time, I felt a little more brave. I was frustrated not being able to decipher the drawing for so long, and, while my mom was feet away, I stopped in front of the camper door and took a moment to really look at the drawing. Upon closer inspection, the paper was filthy. I remember doing a project in elementary school where we soaked printer paper in black coffee to make it look aged, and that's what it reminded me of. My mom walked on without noticing I'd stopped following her, but my eyes stayed fixed on the indistinct mass of dirt-caked scribbles until I could make out what looked to be a tiny, malformed face. My stomach turned. I immediately felt cold and disgusted as my eyes trailed over the rest of the image. I didn't know what kind of creature it was at the time, but now I can look back and say the drawing was a badly deformed fetus inside a mass of large, perfect circles like those made by a circular ring ruler. Its face was contorted as if in pain. It was so graphically disturbing and seemed to portray this odd sense of suffering that stuck with me for days. As a child, I didn't know how to process it, and the mental image still makes me sick to think about. I'd never seen anything like it before. Adrenaline flooded my body, and my chest hurt with fear, but I selfishly thought of my glorious little trips for ring pops and said absolutely nothing as I followed behind my mom. This was, in retrospect, a classically terrible idea. It's one of those things you scream at main characters in movies for. Ever since my ill feelings toward the camper had been elevated by the drawing on the door, I thought about it every time we drove by, and about a month later my mom once again graced us with several bucks and permission to walk down to Rotten Robbie and grab our respective snacks. I thought about telling my sister about what I'd seen on the way there, but she was older and braver, and I was terrified she'd make me cross the street with her to check it out. It was a bright, sunny day, and I told myself with false certainty that nothing was going to happen. If I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it'd go away. We walked past the camper, and it was thankfully uneventful. On the walk back, I felt more comfortable and was focused on fighting open my candy wrapper while my sister walked alongside me. We passed the camper a second time, but I didn't give it half as much thought as the first time. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I recall being interrupted mid-sentence as my sister softly yet firmly said my name. There was a distinct fear in her voice that immediately set me on edge, like a bucket of ice water. All my senses heightened, and I became aware of everything, including the sound of haphazard footsteps about 10 feet behind us. It was accompanied by a heavy rustling sound like a heavy backpack, and nervously I half turned my head to look. A man with a long, unkempt beard and wearing many layers of ragged clothing stood behind us, eyes unmistakably burning into our backs as he walked. His movements weren't normal. It was a drunken shuffle, like each of his feet were unimaginably heavy and needed to be moved one grand effort at a time. His shoulders were skewed, and his head tilted downward with a strange arch of his neck. I could hear his shoes scraping the gravel with every step, but rather than seeming genuinely intoxicated, it was as if he was intentionally meandering our direction like a zombie with a direct effort to frighten us. Behind him, I saw the camper door was wide open for the first time in all the years we'd spent living there and realized this was the man who had been living inside. "He's following us." I choked out, my eyes filling with tears. My mind was spinning as I stared straight ahead again, the wide street and sidewalks abnormally empty all around. My sister grabbed my hand. She squeezed it tightly enough to hurt without looking my way, speaking carefully under her breath. "On the count of 3, we race home," she told me in a very serious tone of voice. I couldn't reply through the growing lump in my throat, but every single cell in my body understood we had to put some distance between us and this man as quickly as possible. She began to count steadily while we walked faster, and the most terrifying part is that he started running before we even had a chance to. He must have heard her directions to me and tried to get a head start by sprinting our direction before she got to 3, but his footsteps were noisy, and we bolted like deer the instant we heard him behind us. I'll never forget it. The chase felt exactly like you imagine in your nightmares, the fear your pursuer is inches away from grabbing your arm or a fistful of your hair. I pictured myself being dragged into the van with nobody around to see or hear me. We ran so fast we didn't even have the breath to scream, and peering back behind me about 10 seconds later, I saw him running our direction with absolutely none of the impairment he showed with those zombie-like steps moments before. I think back on it now, and he may have been deliberately pretending to be handicapped to lower our guard so we wouldn't start running. The thought is terrifying, but I can't rationalize it any other way. We made it to our grandparents' house and, without looking behind us, yanked open the stubborn old door before slamming it closed and scrambling past their excited dogs to get as deep in the house as possible. I don't even think we locked it, as our main goal was getting within the line of sight of any adults as quickly as possible. My mom was talking to my grandpa at the table and gave us an amused look when we bounded into the living room. Since we were kids, running around wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and she didn't ask what happened as we collapsed on the couch and tried to catch our breath. The inside of the house felt so safe and felt in such good spirits that I didn't even want to bring up what had just happened. Like waking up from a nightmare you didn't want to talk about, I was desperate to go back to normalcy. I wanted to forget it entirely, to unwrap my candy and act like everything was completely normal for the sake of my own sanity, and that's exactly what I did. I asked my sister a few years back if she remembered this incident. I'm 25 and she's 28 now, and her response was strange. She remembered immediately without the need for me to provide details, but she quickly waved it off and insisted he had to have been a bored homeless man looking to spook some kids walking home with no real intent to harm anyone. I don't know. I'd like to believe it's some innocent misunderstanding, but like they always say about gut feelings, they're rarely wrong. I feel in my heart that he wanted to hurt me and my sister that day. I never told her or anyone else about the strange drawing on the door, and I'm not sure if my sister saw the open door and connected him to the camper or not. It's one of my biggest regrets, as I would hate for any other children to have been less fortunate after innocently walking past the camper in the shade. I believe he may have chosen the spot between the park and gas station deliberately due to the number of children walking around the area. I never saw the camper again a day or so after this. I'm not proud of how I handled this and would encourage anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation to contact authorities immediately for the safety of others around. I don't know if maybe this whole story comes off as melodramatic, but it was very real and very frightening in a way I can't forget.